They never thought they'd lose you. To them, you were always a constant, something permanent, like the sun that rises every day. They moved through the relationship like your presence was guaranteed, like you would always be there, no matter how far they pulled away. And for a long time, you were. You stayed, even when the signs were clear that something wasn't right. You convinced yourself that love meant endurance, that patience would eventually lead to the happiness you both deserved. But somewhere along the way, they stopped appreciating you. What began as a beautiful bond slowly turned into a series of half-hearted attempts, careless words, and inconsistent actions. They grew comfortable, assuming that no matter how many times they let you down, you would be there. And you were. But with each moment that passed, something in you quietly shifted. It wasn't obvious at first. You kept showing up because you believed in love and loyalty. But inside, something started to change. You stayed through the mood swings, through the silent treatments and the empty conversations. You let them get away with things that should have never been acceptable. Each time they brushed you off, each time they took you for granted, you believed you could handle it. You thought that love meant waiting, that loyalty meant enduring, that patience would eventually bring them back to you. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't understand, was that you weren't staying out of weakness. You weren't staying because you had nowhere else to go. You stayed because you had hope. You stayed because you believed in the person you first fell in love with, the person they promised to be. But even the strongest hope has its breaking point. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no drama. It didn't happen in one explosive moment. It happened quietly. It happened in the stillness, in the moment when you stopped trying to fix what they continued to neglect. You stopped reminding them to care. You stopped explaining why something hurt. You stopped seeking validation from someone who no longer valued your presence. You didn't leave with anger. You didn't leave with resentment. You left with peace because you realized that staying was hurting you more than leaving ever could. And that realization, that quiet moment of emotional detachment, was the turning point. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. The day you emotionally detached was the day they started noticing. They didn't understand the gravity of what was happening. At first, they didn't notice the shift. They thought it was just a phase, maybe even a sign of maturity. You weren't as reactive as you used to be. You weren't asking for reassurance constantly. You stopped fighting for their attention. But what they failed to see was that you weren't just calm or mature. You were done. When someone has been used to receiving all your emotional energy, your love, your care, and your patience, they begin to expect it. They begin to take it for granted. But the moment you stopped giving, the moment you stopped bending over backward to make things work, that's when they started feeling the void. They didn't notice when you stopped reaching out, when you stopped making the first move, when you stopped trying to fix everything. But eventually, they did. It wasn't your anger that got their attention. It was your absence. The silence became louder than any argument. When you stopped fighting for their love, when you stopped demanding their attention, it felt like you had disappeared. They started to feel the weight of your absence in ways they hadn't before. Your emotional withdrawal, though subtle, became the loudest message they'd ever received. They thought they were safe, that you would always be there. But now they were facing something they hadn't anticipated, uncertainty. For the first time, they weren't sure if you would still tolerate their behavior. For the first time, they weren't sure if you would always choose them, because you had stopped choosing them. And that scared them more than anything else. Because now, they realized that you weren't just someone they could take for granted. You were someone who could walk away, and that possibility terrified them. They started feeling the loss before you had even left. The emotional gap between you two grew, and with every passing day, the distance between you widened. They couldn't understand it. They started questioning what went wrong. They remembered the good moments, the laughs, the deep conversations, the promises made. They tried to reconnect, to pull you back in. But they didn't realize it was too late. You weren't pushing them away because you hated them. You were pulling away because you had started valuing yourself. And self-worth, once discovered, is hard to lose. The more they tried to pull you back, the more they realized it wasn't as easy as it used to be. Their attempts felt almost like a desperate reaction to the void they were now experiencing. They started sending longer messages, making plans, and saying things they hadn't said in months. They even tried being vulnerable, trying to pull at your heartstrings, hoping to bring back the warmth they once took for granted. But you saw through it. You knew the difference between real change and just another attempt to fill the emptiness left by your absence. They weren't really changing. They were reacting to the fear of losing you. For the first time, they were feeling what it was like to be on the other side, the side where they had to fight for your attention, for your love, for your presence. You weren't the same person who would always wait, always forgive, always bend. Now, you were someone who knew the value of their own time, energy, and heart. You weren't chasing after someone who had stopped chasing you. You weren't waiting for someone who had no intention of keeping their promises. You were moving forward, and that's when they felt the real sting of your absence. What they didn't realize was this: you weren't leaving because you stopped loving them. You were leaving because you started loving yourself more. They had mistaken your loyalty for weakness, and now they were paying the price. It wasn't their anger or disappointment that hurt you. It was the realization that they had never fully understood your worth until they saw you start walking away. And when they finally realized that you weren't just emotionally detached, you were emotionally independent, they started to panic. The fear of losing you became their greatest regret, because for the first time, they understood that you weren't a guarantee. You weren't always going to be there. And that thought, that understanding, was enough to shake them to their core. They had always assumed that you would be there, that you would always be loyal, always be present, no matter what. But when they realized you could walk away, when they realized you weren't someone who would wait around forever, it broke something inside them. You weren't punishing them. You weren't seeking revenge. You were simply protecting yourself. You were choosing your peace over the chaos they brought into your life. You were choosing to let go of what no longer served you, even if it hurt. And when you finally let go, it wasn't because you stopped loving. It was because you loved yourself enough to know when to walk away.